Hi, welcome to section 3.3. We're on page 72, and today we're talking about the present tense of regular ER and IR verbs. So last chapter we talked about how to form the present tense of regular AR verbs, but now we're going to talk about how to form regular ER and IR verbs. So if we look at the chart here on page 72, we can see the conjugation pattern for the AR verbs that we already learned, and that's conjugated with the verb trabajar, which means to work. Okay, so if you remember, right, what we need to do whenever we conjugate a verb, we get rid of that ending, okay? And then we're going to end up with this. And then we add the endings that follow. So, o, as, a, amos, and an. And that's how we form the present tense for the AR verbs. So we're going to follow the exact same pattern whenever we use we conjugate our ER and IR verbs. So here we have the verbs comer and escribir. So we start with comer. Okay, first step. Actually, let me just draw this out real fast. 2, 3. So you'll notice here we have singular, plural, first, second, and third person. We're going to knock off that ER. Okay, so we'll end up with now, remember, of course, that, we still have the pronouns understood. So this is still yo and tú, él, ella, nosotros, nosotras, and ellos, ellas, and ustedes. Usted. Okay, we still have those. So to conjugate, we're going to follow the pattern right here. Okay, so it'll be yo como, tú comes, él come, nosotros comemos, and ellos comen. Okay, yo como, tú comes, él come, nosotros comemos, and ellos comen. Okay, so that's for ER verbs. So whenever we need to form an IR conjugation, it's going to be very similar to the ER, and you'll see that in just a second. The only difference, is going to be here. Okay, so let me delete all of this really quickly. Okay, almost done. Okay, so we start with our new verb here. Let's try the verb that they give us here, which is escribir. Okay, so first we're going to knock off that IR, and then we end up with that. So it'll be okay, and then we add our endings. So, yo escribo, tú escribes, él escribe, nosotros escribimos, and ellos escriben. So the only difference that we see between the ER and IR verbs in the present tense is going to be first person plural. So here we have IMOS, but then for ER verbs, we'll have hemos. Okay? So they're almost identical. You just want to make sure that you're marking those. It's going to be different. Okay? But for the rest of them, it'll be that E as opposed to the A where we have O, as, a, amos, an. Okay? All right. So with these are very similar. I still recommend the same thing, which I recommend whenever you're doing verb conjugations, which is that you memorize a verb in the whole form instead of just the random letters, because just the random letters floating around in your head can be harder to keep track of. But again, do whatever works best for you. That's just what I recommend my students do. So, just like we just talked about, AR, ER, and IR verbs are going to have very similar endings, but you want to make sure that you study the chart to make sure that you know the patterns, what the similarities are, and how they're different. Okay? So, like AR verbs, the yo forms of ER and IR verbs are going to end in O. Okay? The endings for AR verbs are going to begin with A, except for the yo form, right? Which we already talked about. So we're going to have okay? We're going to have the endings for AR verbs start with this, except for yo form, which is going to be like that irregular form. And then for ER, IR verbs, it's going to begin with the A, except for the yo form. Okay? ER and IR verbs have the exact same endings, except in the nosotros forms and the vosotros forms, which we don't focus on in this class. Okay, so here on the next page, we have some examples. We have some examples of common ER and IR verbs. And one thing I want to point out to you is when you see a list of verbs, make flashcards if you have to so that you learn the verbs as you go. Because for each verb, you have to know how to conjugate it, but you also have to know what it means. So that way you slowly start building up your vocabulary and learning more verbs. It's going to make it easier to learn the language. So we have some common ER and IR verbs. The ER verbs, aprender, which means to learn, beber, which means to drink, comer, which means to eat, comprender is to understand, correr is to run, creer is to believe, and when you have en after it, it means to believe in. Deber plus an infinitive, should, ought to, or must. So for that one, I like if you're saying I should eat, you have your infinitive. You're going to conjugate deber. So for the yo form, it would be yo debo comer. So when you see deber plus the infinitive, that's a verb phrase. This one is conjugated, and this one stays in infinitive form. And the infinitive form means that it's still in that AR, ER, or IR form where you have that ending. It hasn't been conjugated. That's what that means. Okay? So, and then we have leer at the end. We have our IR verbs, abrir, which means to open, asistir, to attend. Okay, so that brings up a good point I'm going to make right now. Asistir looks like assist. Right? They look like they would be the same verb, but they are not. Asistir means to attend, right? Whereas assist means to help. This is an example of a false cognate. Okay, where you have words in different languages that look like they would mean the same thing, but they don't. Okay, so that would be one thing to keep to make sure you're looking out for. Okay, don't assume just because a verb looks like a word in English that they mean the same thing. A lot of times they will, but often, sometimes they won't. Okay, so we also have compartir, to share. Decidir means to decide. That would be an example of a true cognate. Right, because they mean the same thing. Escribir means to write. Recibir is to receive. Another example. Cognate. And vivir means to live. Okay, so that's it for this lesson, but I'm going to go ahead and do the manos a la obra with you. So as always, feel free to pause the recording if you want to do the activity along with me. So let's start with correr. Okay. Graciela corre en el parque. Tú corres en el campus. Mi primo y yo corremos. Yo corro los domingos. Mis hermanos corren. Usted corre en la plaza. Ustedes corren los lunes. La familia corre. And here la familia is the family, but because it's a singular noun, it takes a singular verb, even though there's more than one person. Marcos y yo corremos. Okay? Now for abrir. Okay, ellos abren la puerta. Carolina abre la maleta. Yo abro las ventanas. Nosotras abrimos los libros. Usted abre el cuaderno. Tú abres la ventana. Ustedes abren las maletas. Él abre el libro. Los muchachos abren los cuadernos. Okay, and finally, last one, aprender, which means to learn. Abrir means to open. I don't remember if I said that. Abrir means to open. Okay. Aprender, to learn. Él aprende español. Ustedes aprenden español. Maribel y yo aprendemos inglés. Tú aprendes japonés. Ustedes aprenden francés. Mi hijo aprende alemán. Yo aprendo alemán. Usted aprende inglés. Y nosotros aprendemos lenguas extranjeras. Okay? That's APRNDEMOS, in case you couldn't tell. All right, that's it for this lesson. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'll be more than happy to answer those for you.